All right, this week we're going to cover experiential learning theory, and that's going to be the main theory for the week. And we're going to talk about active learning, so that would be a subcategory that is connected to experiential learning. So these two topics are related, just like we've done in previous weeks. But before we move into experiential learning and what it is and the cycles of experiential learning, I want to talk a little bit about the connection to other topics from the semester. So in week 2, we started with social learning theory and leadership. And that was really, how do we learn within groups? Because most of your classes and when you get out into your career, you're going to have to work with others. So that's an important concept, that interpersonal communication, that intrapersonal communication, if we want to tie it in to week 3. And that's when we covered multiple intelligence theory. And that week, we covered not only Garner's multiple intelligences, but we also talked about learning style. And that week, if the previous week was about how do we learn socially within a group, week 3 was really more about how do we take information from the environment, environmental stimulus, and how do we take that information in as efficiently as possible based on our preferences for learning. So visually, auditory, reading and writing, or kinesthetically. How do we bring that in and get it from short-term memory to long-term memory? The week after that was types of knowledge in Bloom's taxonomy. And that week was really about the course that you're in, the subject matter that you're learning. If you're in a history class, you focus on declarative information. If you're in a kinesiology class that has a high skill component to it, then the procedural knowledge is extremely important. The process is important. So that's telling you what to focus on based on the class. This week is more about the method of teaching. So what is your preferred method of teaching? Mine is experiential learning, and I'm going to tell you why in this lecture. But would you prefer to sit in a lecture-based course? Would you prefer to just watch videos on YouTube using your learning style? Would you want to go through an interactive course, but you don't necessarily interact with the professor? You just watch videos and take quizzes, is like you would normally get in an online course? Or would you want something like an apprenticeship, like we used to learn using apprenticeships? So if you were going to be, let's go all the way back to medieval days, if you were going to be a blacksmith, you were going to be paired up with an expert in the field and you were going to learn from them. Let's bring that more to modern day times. If you were going to be a welder or an auto mechanic, or if you were going to go work on AC repair, you're going to be paired up with an expert in the field. You're not just going to learn from a book. You have to get those physical skills. I believe experiential learning is just as important for theoretical concepts. And that's why I've brought in these active learning strategies, these activities, where I can get you to the upper levels of learning, but you can learn in a true experiential sense, meaning that y'all are my apprentices when it comes to these activities. And it is my preferred mode of teaching. And it should make sense, because not only do I teach education, but I teach kinesiology. So experiential learning is huge when it comes to exercise testing, prescription, designing programs for people. You're often doing a lot of hands-on learning, and experiential learning is extremely important for that. Now let's talk about the theory itself. So John Dewey came up with the theory, or kind of coined the term experiential learning, but what he was talking about was apprenticeships, internships, learning from an expert in the field, and it doesn't just have to be hands-on learning. In a nutshell, you're having an experience. So if we look at this cycle, you have an experience, you reflect on that experience, you think and conceptualize that experience, kind of create a hypothesis by acting it out, and then that creates a new experience. So just to connect it back to week 2 when we talked about social learning theory, I've overlaid zone of proximal development over that cycle. Now Kolb is the one that came up with the cycle. John Dewey came up with the phrase experiential learning, but Kolb kind of defined the elements so it would be easy to visualize. So let's just look at Kolb's model real quick. You have an experience. You reflect on that. You analyze it and evaluate it, the experience itself. You link it to other concepts, and so that's what we're going to do with the activity today. Is we're going to use this model. You're going to form a hypothesis about successes and failures, and that's going to create a new experience, and eventually that will lead to success if you do that enough times. How is that linked to zone of proximal development? Well, you can take that same cycle and do that individually for some subjects that you can do independently. Some subjects or topics or skills, you're going to need help from your teacher or peers, but you can get those done, and you can follow this cycle to do that. And some things you can't do yet, but you could still go through this cycle and develop a hypothesis on why you're not successful to see if you can work out any of the problems. If you do that enough, eventually you'll be successful. So that's how zone of proximal development is interconnected with experiential learning. You can follow the same process through each one of these levels in the zone of proximal development. All right, let's talk about this in terms of the activity that we're going to do. So you're going to have an experience with a bow drill. You're going to reflect and make observations about it. Here's what's unique about the bow drill and why I put it in this portion of the class is because it's going to have elements that you are known, that you understand and can do not only by yourself, but some of these you're going to need help from other people. But you'll be able to link it to other concepts, meaning you may have to make your own cordage. We're not going to do that for this activity. It'd be too much to do in one day, but you could. You're going to have to tie clove hitches to tie the cordage onto the bow. That's something that's known. You already understand the concept of how a spindle works with a fireboard, except now we're going to size up those spindles. So those are all known. What is new with this skill is the position you've got to get into. You're going to have a socket to protect your hand from the spindle. That's something we haven't had before. You're going to have a bow. That's something we haven't had before. And so there are some new elements. And I like that because not only can you draw on prior experience, but you're going to have to learn something new, and you're going to have to rely on some of your peers and even the teacher to help you out. Now, the bow drill, if we want to just talk about the activity itself, the reason you see it in most survival manuals is because you're not limited by most resources. You can find the resources for this fairly easy, whereas like the hand drill, what we did in the prior week, the gas pedal or the thumb loop, you need some pretty specific materials. You need a really straight spindle, and it needs to be made out of the right material. That's not true for the bow drill. You can use almost any softwood, and even some hardwoods will work fairly well. Now, if you're in a class where we're not using primitive fire, just think about the activity we would be doing. Think about it in terms of experiential learning and how it relates to zone of proximal development. What I want you to make your videos about is this cycle. So have an experience. So when you film this is what I want you to film. You're not teaching the skill back to me, just like in all the previous activities. You're telling me how the theory is connected to the activity, how the activity helps you learn the theory or the elements of the theory. So show that you had an experience with the bow drill. Talk about what you analyzed and reflected on based on the observations of that experience. How is it linked to other ideas? And I just described those for you. Cordage, tying knots, spindles, and new concepts. Now, when you get to the hypothesis testing, that means you've had to analyze and evaluate at this step here to come up with a hypothesis after linking it to other ideas. And you have to not only look at what you were successful at, but what did you fail at? If you didn't make an ember by this step, you're going to have a new experience. So you're going to work out the issues, and I may have to help you with that. So that may be the guided portion here in zone of proximal development. You may have to rely on me to tell you what you're doing wrong because this is new and novel, and that's going to cause that whole cycle to start over again. Eventually, if you do that enough times, you're going to be successful, and you should be able to get an ember in this class or with this activity. Or if you're doing another activity, how does this cycle help you learn that process? Okay, I I want to end the video here, but that's going to tie us into active learning. Everything I just described was active learning, but you can use other methods, and we're going to talk about those once we get down here to the last slide. This is normally what I draw out on the board when I introduce that concept.